This morning's reading is a poem titled Famous by Naomi Shihab Nye. The river is famous to the fish. The loud voice is famous to the silence, which knew it would inherit the earth before anyone said so. The cat sleeping on the fence is famous to the birds watching him from the birdhouse. The tear is famous, briefly, to the cheek. The idea you carry close to your bosom is famous to your bosom. The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is famous only to floors. The bent photograph is famous to the one who carries it, and not at all famous to the one who is pictured. I want to be famous. To shuffling men who smile while crossing streets, sticky children in grocery lines, famous as the one who smiled back. I want to be famous in the way that a pulley is famous or a buttonhole, not because it did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. I feel like I've said this a few times already, but one last time, good morning, friends. Truly, it is the season when so many faith traditions are celebrating important holidays. And this morning features one of those in particular. In many of the Christian congregations up and down the street from us, today marks the beginning of Holy Week. It's Palm Sunday, an occasion that celebrates and marks the day that Jesus returns to Jerusalem at the very end of his ministry. And as the story goes, Jesus enters the city on the back of a donkey. He specifically asks for a donkey, and he makes his way slowly along the roads to the center of the city. And all along the way, there are people lining the roads. And they're taking off their cloaks and placing them on the ground for the donkey to walk on. And all along the path, people are holding palm fronds and waving them as Jesus passes by. Worth mentioning at this point is that this story is full of symbolism that would be super obvious to your average first century audience, but it takes some research to get into all of those layers in 2026. But it's worth it because it reveals some really subtle paradoxes about how the Palm Sunday story is told. On the one hand, there are symbols of celebration and royalty and victory. Spreading the cloaks on the ground was an act of deference and respect, shown to individuals considered high royalty so that their feet don't have to touch the ground directly. And the palm fronds being waved were a symbol most closely associated with the goddess Nike or Victoria, a personification of victory and triumph. On the other hand, there are also symbolic elements that undercut this story. The donkey was traditionally seen as an animal of peace, a humble counterpart to the otherwise warlike horse. And even though the palm branches and the spread cloaks invite this image of a traditional Roman triumphal parade, very few other symbols of that sort of procession are found. Most notably that this parade, if you can call it that, consists of just a single person on a donkey. Clearly, this story is about someone who commanded great fame, but there's some confusion about what kind of fame we're talking about. Because when we talk about someone being famous, there's a general idea that comes to mind when we say that word. An idea that is loud and crowded, a fame that makes people want to take off their cloaks and wave palm fronds to welcome their arrival. I'm sure we can think of celebrities who, if they came walking down Mass Ave, people would shout joyfully and wave, maybe not palm fronds in Boston in March, but they would wave something. And at the same time, that word famous can feel a little odd depending on what the fame is for. In the Palm Sunday story, the person being celebrated is not a rock star or a politician or an artist, but is someone mostly famous for acts of healing and teaching. And while I will absolutely say that our doctors and teachers deserve triumphal parades, if we had a parade to lift up the works of healers and teachers today, it would be a different kind of fame. It's a fame that's not measured by cultural or societal impact. It's a fame measured in the direct impact that one human can have on another. I've been thinking about this idea of fame a lot ever since I read the poem that I read to you earlier, Famous by Naomi Shihab Nye. As a little peek behind the curtain, when I write sermons, sometimes I have an idea of a theme and then I find a reading to go with it. This was very much the other way around. I stumbled across this beautiful poem and could not stop thinking about it. The river is famous to the fish. The loud voice is famous to the silence. The tear, briefly, is famous to the cheek. There's something so poetic and amazing about the way that this idea is expressed. If you asked me before, do I want to be famous? I would have said unambiguously no, not at all. But the way that Nye tells it, it at least made me stop and think about it. Because the poet speaks from a very specific perspective. She was born into a Palestinian-American family moving between the US and the West Bank leading up to the 6 Days War. And then she built a career writing poetry at the unique intersection of Middle Eastern, Mexican-American, and Native American voices. When the terror attacks of 2001 happened, she became an outspoken voice against the reflexive prejudice that many Arab Americans faced, with her writing centered on the lived experience of the individual in times when grand geopolitical forces are in motion, and those forces don't realize who and what they're hurting. So when Naomi Shihab Nye writes about fame, she's not talking about a fame that is sought for the sake of being famous, a fame that is loud, a fame that is in and of itself the goal. No, she speaks of fame as a recognition of the relational nature with which we move through the world. The river is famous to the fish, not because fame matters to the river, but because the river and fish share a relationship, each meaning something to the other. The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is famous only to floors. That fame is not one that is loud and intense, not the fame that a celebrity has. It's a quiet and familiar fame. The sensation of seeing a familiar face, the face of someone who you've been through a lot with. When this poet writes about fame, about the idea of being known to one another, she writes about something shared and mutual, something tactile and clingy like Velcro, that occurs when proximity and shared purpose cause two people to be forever enriched by each other's presence. Thinking about the people closest to you, by definition, you are indeed very, very famous to them. But perhaps even more importantly, to the people we do not know well, but still treat with love and kindness, to those people we have the ability to choose to be famous for all the right reasons. To be famous, to live famously, then simply means to have acted in a way that leaves an impression on someone else. Because even though I've said the words fame and famous over and over to the point where they're probably losing their meaning, let me be really specific. When I speak of fame and living famelessly, I'm talking about radical interdependence. Interdependence because it's a recognition of how all our lives, each other, and the world are tied together in the very core of our being, and radical because we see this as unconditional and ever-changing. As Unitarian Universalists, we have held up radical interdependence as a virtue many times. It's part of our seventh principle, recognizing the interdependent web of life. It's one of our 6 shared values, where it reiterates interdependence as a component of loving community. In a world and a society where independence and individualism are raised up as signs of idealism and strength, we recognize that who we are in community, who we can be in community and in connection, is so much more than the sum of our parts. That to wrestle with the big questions and the big issues of the day, we do more. We learn more, we are more in our togetherness than in our separatedness. So the reason the casual definition of famous sounds weird in the context we're talking about is because it's limited by the same individualistic societal standards. And what Naomi Shihab Nye shows us is a version of fame that exists not in solitude, but in a deep and relational interdependence. And I think that matters very much in this moment. Because just as Nye lifts up the voices of the individual experience in the face of geopolitical struggle, just so do I struggle to find meaning when what faces us seems so big. And I can't be the only one that feels like that, right? Like, for what feels like my entire adult life, I've woken up to news that is horrifying and saddening. Stories of harm and cruelty, both far away and very, very close to home. It's all too important to ignore, and all of it feels so much bigger when I'm alone. Can anyone else relate to that feeling? It's somewhere at the intersection of helplessness, being pulled in many ways, and in feeling small. And it was that feeling of being small and the ills of the world being so big that the closing lines of Naomi Shihab Nye's poem come in. I want to be famous in the way that a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole. Not because it did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. There is so much we can do. There is so much we do. We make sandwiches and serve hot meals to our local community. We show up at protests for what is right and needed by the thousands. We take care of each other in times of turmoil and loss. We don't just stumble into relation with each other, into this community. We step into it directly, proactively, famously, or at least famous to the people for whom it matters. A buttonhole and a pulley are famous for what they do because they hold tension, a rope or a thread being pulled tight to hold things together. They represent bridging connections and all that that entails. It doesn't have to be spectacular for it to matter to someone, to everyone. So, as we go into the world on this day, I invite you to think about what quiet fame you are known for, and what quiet fame you would like to cultivate in your life. Odds are, It won't be something that people will respond with laying their cloaks on the ground and waving palm fronds. But that doesn't diminish the importance of your actions and your words. Being famous in our interdependence means being famous to those we are connected with, both near and far. Because we can't help but affect the lives of those around us, and if we can't help but be famous for something, we can choose to make that connection matter. In her writings, our poet speaks about the idea that the local is a sacred space, that peace is not something found in grand treaties, but in direct recognition of actions in community. And that is not naive to the grand forces that swirl around us. It is a direct response to those. When we feel powerless or small, and when we see the scale of what must change in the world, we have a starting point. And that is to fill our days with acts we wish to be known for. Small kindnesses, grand gestures, acts of service, acts of love, acts of caring, acts of togetherness. Come, let's live all these things famously. May it be so.